Thank you all for coming out, and it's nice to be back at Okamic in person for a change. Today, I'm going to talk about Frances Perkins, who I've called the mother of Social Security. The mother of Social Security? We associate Social Security with the New Deal and the president, Franklin Roosevelt. And I suspect many of you in this room don't know that the real author of Social Security is this woman who's hardly recognized in American history books. This is a photograph of one of the very first cabinet meetings of the new president, Franklin Roosevelt. And you will see there are not quite a dozen very serious looking men. And in the back row, hardly visible, one woman. She was indeed the first female cabinet member ever in American history. The average age of the men in this picture was 59. She was 52, so she was on the young side here. She was dressed very primly. This photograph is not in color, but if it had been, you would have seen that she was wearing a black or navy suit and a very sedate hat and really no makeup at all. She was a controversial choice, there's no doubt about it. And during the very first cabinet meeting, she purposely said nothing until she was called upon to give a report. At the very end, Vice President Nance Garner went up to her and complimented her on her behavior. Frances Perkins would later say that she had studied male colleagues. In fact, she had a file called Notes on the Male Mind. How I wish I could see that file. And what she had discovered was that men would pay more attention to women if they reminded them of their mother. And so the sedate, prim dress, the hat, and she said, I tried as much as possible to have a mask. I wanted to give the impression of a quiet woman who didn't buzz all the time. It's not good to interrupt men. I pretended it was men's conversation on the porch of a golf club. You didn't butt in with bright ideas. Make no mistake, this woman had a lot of bright ideas. This quiet, serious woman was about to bring about a revolution in this country. Roosevelt had been under pressure to put a woman in the cabinet because there was Eleanor Roosevelt, who was always telling him that. And women in the Democratic Party had been important in his election. But before Frances Perkins would take the job, she drove to Hyde Park and she had an amazing conversation with the soon-to-be inaugurated President of the United States. She said, I'll only take the job if you support my goals. And those goals include a 40-hour work week, the end of child labor, unemployment compensation, a system of Social Security and health insurance for all. Nothing like this has ever been done in this country before. You know that, don't you? Are you sure you want these things done? Otherwise, you don't want me as Secretary of Labor. Now, can you imagine having that conversation with the president-elect? It's 1933. Women had only had the vote 13 years. This is a woman stepping into a man's world, a male-dominated world of government. And she's telling the president, you don't want me. I won't take the job unless you support my goals. And he did. And he did want her. Frances Perkins would be the Secretary of Labor throughout Roosevelt's tenure as president. She is the single longest serving Secretary of Labor. And all of us in this room benefit from what she achieved. Who was this truly remarkable woman? She was born Fanny Coralie Perkins in 1880, actually in my hometown of Boston. You know, I can never give a presentation without throwing Boston in there somewhere. Although the family really didn't live there long. They lived in Worcester, Massachusetts, and she spent her childhood between Worcester, Massachusetts, and her grandmother's homestead in Maine, in Newcastle, Maine. Here's another photo of her. I love these wonderful photos with a hat, you know, and a young child. The homestead in Maine had been established by her great-great-grandfather, and it belonged to her wonderful grandmother, Cynthia Otis Perkins. James Otis was one of her ancestors. He was a Revolutionary War patriot and hero. The family had owned a brick-making factory, and they had been very successful for a while. But by the time of Fanny's birth, brick-making had fallen on hard times, and the only thing that was really left of the family estate was the house. This magnificent house called the Brick House, which is still there in Newcastle, Maine. Her father tried a variety of jobs. He tried dairy farming, then he went to Boston and he was clerk in a department store. But finally he went to Worcester, where he opened up a stationery and office supply store. Now, Worcester was growing, and so it was a fortuitous event that he chose that city. As a result, he prospered financially, and Fanny essentially grew up in a middle-class family. They attended the very stern Congregational Church in Massachusetts. They were dyed-in-the-wool Republicans. They were conservative, but she was very attached to this maternal grandmother who she visited quite often. And her grandmother taught her those Yankee values. And you know those Yankee values. One of them is to keep quiet unless you have something to say. Just try and get directions in Maine if you're lost. It's absolutely impossible. Tenacity, steadfastness, those were the values that she was taught. A recent biographer has said that Fanny was really an exceptional child. She was precocious, she was unusually verbal and articulate, and she was actually closer to her father than her mother. Believe it or not, her father taught her Greek when she was 8 years old and was absolutely insistent that this daughter of his would go to college. This is the time when only 3% of women went to college. So he was very, very forward looking. Her mother took her hat shopping when she was about 10 years old. And they bypassed all the very pretty, frilly kind of hats. And her mother settled on this tri-corner hat, sort of like a revolutionary hat. And she said to her, "You have a broad face, so you always should wear a hat that matches the width of your face." The message that Fanny got, not unlike the message that Eleanor Roosevelt got, was, "You are not beautiful. You will have to depend on other skills and abilities to succeed." This is a wonderful photo of a young Frances Perkins. She went to Worcester Classical High School with a lot of other affluent students, mostly boys. She showed qualities that would be important later. She was articulate, she was good in an emergency, and she was somewhat of a rebel. She declared herself, to her family's horror, that she was a Democrat. And of course, the Democrats were associated with the party of poor immigrants, and that isn't the community that Fanny grew up in. When she was a young teen, she read a book that influenced her. And in this age of book banning, I was thinking how important some books can be. This was a book by Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis was a journalist, a muckraker, a photographer, and he had written a book full of photographs called How the Other Half Lives. And it was a book about the streets of New York at the turn of the century. And the streets of New York at the turn of the century were filled with poor immigrants who were flooding into the United States. It was filled with children, as you can see, who slept in the streets. It was filled with people who lived in situations like this. This is a tenement. It rented rooms for 5 cents a night with 12 people in a room just 13 feet long. And there were photos of home sweatshops, people making clothes or cigars in their home and how they lived. She became conscious at this young age of how the other half lived and of the mistreatment of workers. She went off to college to Mount Holyoke, which was accessible by train. It was a women's college near her home. She loved it. Mount Holyoke has a beautiful campus. There's a picture of her in one of her famous hats in her junior year at Mount Holyoke. The founder of Mount Holyoke, Mary Lyon, had a motto, and the motto for her young female students was, quote, "Go forward, attempt great things, and do great things." What a wonderful motto. She was popular, called Perk, short for Perkins. She majored, believe it or not, in physics and chemistry and biology. She was popular, the class president. There she is on the left side of this photo. And a close-up again, and there is her graduation picture. But at Mount Holyoke, in her final semester, she took a course in American economic history. taught by this woman, Professor Anna May Soule. And this professor required her students taking American economic history to go out of the classroom and visit an actual factory along the Connecticut River. So that meant that Frances Perkins actually went into a factory, and what she saw were scenes like this. This is actually a very famous photo from the Georgia textile mill by Lewis Hine, but that's what you saw in Connecticut. How old are these children? 6, 7, working barefoot on this machinery? No regulation. Incredible conditions. Of course, child labor was part of the American scene in the early 20th century. Here's a 5-year-old picking cotton. She later said that she was horrified at the work that many women and children were doing, at the unsafe conditions and no regulation. And what you see is the beginning of her social consciousness. You know, it's one influence after the other. After college, of course, the family expected that she would settle down and get married. That wasn't her plan. She graduated in 1902, and she took a job teaching at Ferry Hall, which was an elite school for girls in Lake Forest, Illinois. She changed her name officially to Frances, and she changed her religion officially from the Congregationalist Church to the Episcopal Church. Now, this is important. The Episcopal Church is going to be a major influence in her life. In her free time, she volunteered in settlement houses. Remember the settlement houses, which had been established by Jane Addams and others, which were to help the newly arrived immigrants adjust to the bewildering conditions of the United States. And she said that she became familiar with poverty and the terrible conditions. Quote, "I had to do something about the unnecessary hazards to life, the unnecessary poverty. It was sort of up to me." Watch the growth of this incredible, as I called it, social consciousness. In 1907, she took a position with something that was neutrally called the Philadelphia Research and Protective Association. Translation: it was an organization designed to protect immigrants and young Black women from the South who were coming into the cities from being preyed on into prostitution. And so she was associated with this. She decided to study sociology and economics at the University of Pennsylvania, and then she actually received a master's from Columbia. What was her master's thesis on? A study of malnutrition among children who lived in Hell's Kitchen. Hell's Kitchen was one of the infamous immigrant neighborhoods of New York that was terribly crowded. And her master's thesis was on the malnutrition among these children. In 1910, she took a job with the National Consumers League. Now, the National Consumers League, again, has this neutral title. It was established by Florence Kelley, and the purpose of the National Consumers League was to work for better conditions, particularly for women. And they would investigate factories, and if you passed, you got a label. And you can see the label on the right, National Consumers League, meaning The materials were made under clean and healthful conditions. This is an important part of her growth because as a lobbyist for the National Consumers League, Frances Perkins went to the New York State Capitol in Albany. There she lobbied for legislation to protect workers. There she met up-and-coming politicians like Al Smith and Franklin Roosevelt, who she was not impressed with. She found him young and shallow and arrogant. But she learned how to work with politicians, and she learned that you had to compromise and that you had to be patient. It took the National Consumers League, under her leadership, 2 years to get a law restricting working hours for women in the state of New York to 54 hours a week. And it took 2 years to get that through. And she was very frustrated because the cannery lobby was very strong. And initially, the law did not include cannery workers, most of whom were women. And Al Smith said to her, look, either you get nothing or you start with this law. And so she learned that sometimes you had to compromise, and she learned how to work with politicians. And again, this is part of her training. On March 25th, 1911, was one of those events that changed her life forever. And because it changed her life, it changed our life. It is the famous fire that occurred in the Triangle Shirtwaist Company factory. Shirtwaists were those high-necked blouses that women wore at the turn of the century, you know, high neck and tight at the wrists. March 25th, 1911 was a Saturday, getting close to Easter. So the workers had been told, come in on Saturday. If you don't come in on Saturday, don't come back on Monday. You can see how crowded the factory was. Look closely at the scraps of cloth on the floor. Supposedly, the shirtwaist factory was in a fireproof building called, ironically, the Ash Building. It was the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors. Frances Perkins was having tea with friends in Washington Square, not far from the location of the Triangle Fire. And they heard the fire engines, so they all ran to see what was happening. And what they saw, as the top 3 floors were aflame, were what they thought were bundles of cloth being thrown out of the windows. But of course, they were not bundles of cloth. They were young women jumping to their death. This is the interior of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory after the fire. What we're talking about is almost 50 people who jumped. Almost 150 in all who died, mostly young immigrant women. It is considered one of the greatest tragedies in American history, one of the worst industrial disasters. And I want to tell you that just like 9/11 traumatized this country, this fire traumatized New York. The city morgue was too small to hold the large number of fire victims, so the covered end of the 26th Street Pier was converted into a temporary morgue. And thousands of people gathered there even before the ambulances arrived. Through the night and into the next day, they waited, eventually identifying the dead from a ring, a stocking, a scrap of paper. At the morgue itself, family members and friends had this nightmarish duty of walking past these numbered coffins and trying to identify their loved ones. This was the funeral on April 5th for the unidentified victims of the Triangle Fire. There were leaflets through the city of New York in English, Yiddish, and Italian, calling for workers to join the final tribute. It's estimated that 100,000 people walked in this funeral. And there were 300,000 who stood on the streets. It took about 6 hours for people to pass. And you can see the various unions who had struck 2 years before, asking for safer conditions, were there mourning the loss of their members. David Brooks, the columnist for the New York Times, the Washington Post, you've probably all seen him on television giving commentary. David Brooks has written a book about the development of moral character. And he has several people he features in this book, 8 people. And one of them is Frances Perkins. And he says, after the fire, what had been a career for Frances Perkins turned into a vocation. Moral indignation set her on a different course. She hardened herself. She threw herself into politics, and she had found her purpose in life. Frances Perkins will tell you that this was the day the New Deal was born. Her seeing the Triangle Fire. David Brooks has said she pinioned herself to this cause. And she did. She was appointed to work for a factory investigation commission. This was a factory investigation commission that went into the factories in New York. It was an extraordinary opportunity for people to see what was actually happening in those factories. And there were reports about unsafe conditions, the long hours, the low wages, the dangerous machinery, the child labor, you know what it was like. And as a result, they recommended laws to change this, and a whole spate of laws were passed. So she became very familiar with getting laws passed and actually the conditions that existed in factories. By 1919, Al Smith was governor of New York, and he appointed her to the New York State Industrial Commission, the first female member, of course, because industry was considered a man's world. Not only was she the first female member of this industrial commission, but within 8 years, she was the chair. And she, again, was responsible for dozens of laws that New York passed. In a sense, New York became the model state for protecting other workers. If you're wondering about her personal life, yes, she had married in 1913. She had married Paul Wilson, who was an economist, a statistician, a secretary to the mayor of New York for a while. They had one child, Susanna, pictured here at 5 months. And this is a very rare photo of Paul Wilson, Frances Perkins, and their daughter, Susanna. Now, I have to tell you, within a few years of their marriage, Paul Wilson showed signs of mental illness. And he spent most of their married life in a private sanatorium. She had to support the family. People didn't know about this. She kept it very private because, of course, she had a different last name. And she had to fight to keep that different last name. But her private life was very private. And most people did not realize the state that her husband was in through most of their marriage. And then Franklin Roosevelt became governor of New York when Al Smith ran unsuccessfully for president. And Al Smith said to him, "You better keep this woman. Don't let her go." And so she joined Roosevelt's team, again, becoming a state industrial commissioner. You know what she did before she accepted the position. She went to Hyde Park to talk to him and told him about her progressive policy agenda, and he wanted it to support. And he said, yes, he would support it. She became, while Roosevelt was governor, probably the most knowledgeable person in the whole country on labor conditions and state labor laws. Here she is with Eleanor Roosevelt and Mrs. Percy Pennypacker, who was very active in the Democratic Party. Notice the hat. She wasn't afraid to speak out. President Herbert Hoover in 1930 declared the Depression over. He said the country was recovering. And Frances Perkins from New York State Industrial Commission said, "I beg to differ." She showed figures in the state of New York had shown a steady decline since October. And she said the report was unsatisfactory, that Hoover was wrong, jobs were going down, the state of New York was not recovering, and she disputed him. Roosevelt was impressed that this woman would dare to challenge the president. He had a lot of respect for her because of this. So, Secretary of Labor. Time magazine, of course, put her on the cover because this was such an astonishing thing, a woman as Secretary of Labor. It was a risk for both Roosevelt and Frances Perkins. Roosevelt received a lot of criticism. A woman? Really? A woman? The president of the AFL, William Green, went on a rampage when he heard about this because he wanted a man. The leader of the Seamen's Union said, quote, "I guess we sailors, bricklayers, miners, and builders better get powder puff and lipstick to march in the inaugural parade." One paper described Frances Perkins as 5'5", said she slept in a twin bed and she wore an old-fashioned nightgown. This is what women, of course, had to endure as they broke barriers. I mean, can you imagine describing a man's pajamas? They're describing her old-fashioned nightgown as if that has any relation to her brain and her achievements. When she became Secretary of Labor, I'm sure you all know, it was a time of incredible crisis, the worst economic crisis this country had ever faced. We're talking about an unemployment rate of 30%. The city of Detroit had an unemployment rate of 50%. Thousands of banks had failed. People had lost their homes. There were 1 million hobos roaming the country. There were people selling apples on street corners. You know the images from the Great Depression. The worst economic crisis ever. And there were voices of demagogues, Huey Long, Father Coughlin, who were challenging whether democracy could possibly meet this crisis and find a solution. So it was a risk for Franklin Roosevelt. And it was also a time of despair. Look at the faces on these people who in line for surplus potatoes and cabbage in Cleveland. And here she is. She knew her life would change. She knew her husband, Paul, was ill. He had a lucid day when she was offered the position, and she actually went to talk to him, and he encouraged her to take this position. But he was also afraid that she wouldn't be able to visit him very often. I want to tell you, the day the Social Security Act was passed, Frances Perkins got an emergency call that her husband had somehow found his way out of the sanatorium and was roaming the streets of New York. And she had to get on a train from Washington and go to New York and search for him. So that's always in the background during the time that she is Secretary of Labor. She wondered, but she remembered her grandmother's advice: when a door opens, take it. The door might not be open to a woman again for a long, long time, and I had a kind of duty to other women to walk in and sit down on the chair that was offered, and so establish the right of others long hence and far distant in geography to sit in that high seat. She knew she would have to meet with striking workers. There were a lot of strikes and issues during the 1930s, and she did. Here's a wonderful picture of her meeting with the Carnegie Steel workers, another close-up of that. And she won the support of the workers because of her common sense and of the things she proposed. And they had the feeling that she really understood what they were talking about, because this woman had been in the factories and she had seen what was going on. She faced some rough times. She was the first female cabinet officer to face difficulties just for being a woman. She did receive the gold medal from the Chi Omega sorority for her civic activism. Here it is presented by Eleanor Roosevelt. But simultaneously, there was an attempt to impeach her and remove her from office. And the reason was this man, Harry Bridges. He was an Australian longshoreman who had come to the United States, and he had led a general strike in San Francisco in 1934. He was accused of being a communist, and people wanted him deported, but Frances Perkins refused to deport him. The press criticized her. They said she was foolish, a soft-minded woman. One newspaper described her as, quote, a colorless woman who talked as if she had swallowed a press release, unquote. So, a hard time. but her achievements, incredible achievements. Now, you all know about the Civilian Conservation Corps, I'm sure. If you go to Daytona Beach, part of that boardwalk was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps. There was a Civilian Conservation Corps in Bronson, not that far from Gainesville. It was a New Deal program to put young men to work. Whose brainchild was it? Frances Perkins. From the very beginning, she said to FDR, we've got to get people to work. We've got to get them to work fast so that they have a sense of dignity. So the Civilian Conservation Corps, her brainchild, the Work Progress Administration, billions of dollars to put people to work, building roads, cleaning up schoolyards, doing all kinds of things. That was also her program. And of course, she was concerned about what she labeled dark spots in our social life. Look at this article. Unemployment, sickness, accident, death, and old age manifest themselves in terrible individual experiences. They create social conditions which call for immediate solution. Our social responsibility is great. And the photo on the top right, too old for employment, too young for old age security. The bottom photograph is a photograph of bed upon bed upon bed for people who were homeless and had to sleep in a shelter at night in New York. And she ends by saying, won't you help us to awaken America to its neglect of the aged? The process of recovery is not a simple one, she said in a 1935 radio address. We cannot be satisfied merely with makeshift arrangements, which will tide us over the present emergency. We must devise plans that will not merely alleviate the ills of today, but will prevent, as far as it is humanly possible to do so, the recurrence in the future. And thus, the Social Security Act, August 14, 1935. I hope you all realize how revolutionary this act was. Most of us in this room benefit from Social Security. It provided income security for the elderly and for children whose parents had died. It provided unemployment insurance. It provided support for people who were disabled, people who were blind. It was a sweeping piece of legislation that changed our view of what the government should do. At least she's smiling a little bit in this picture. This is a picture of the signing of the Social Security Act. And you know, the Social Security Act provided unemployment insurance. Guess what act helped people during COVID? CNN had an article in April of 2020. Quote, she came to the rescue during the Great Depression. Now her work is still aiding Americans. The article pointed out that her insistence on unemployment benefits helped millions of people who lost their jobs during COVID. Her biographer, Kristen Downey, has written, quote, there's a whole lot of people whose financial salvation is going to come because Frances Perkins existed. But she wasn't finished. There was also the Wagner Act, that protected labor's right to organize and form unions, which was very important for many people in this country. There was the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, established for the first time minimum wage, maximum hours, restricting child labor. Have you been reading the headlines recently? A food processing organization, Packers Sanitation Services, employing miners to use caustic chemicals to clean razor-sharp saws and other high-risk equipment at 13 meat processing facilities in 8 states. They have now been fined $1.5 million. Thank you, Fair Labor Standards Act. Thank you, Frances Perkins. Child labor in 2023? We need to have a way to make sure that that does not exist. This was Roosevelt's statement on Social Security. Today, a hope of many years standing is in large part fulfilled. The civilization of the past 100 years, with its startling industrial changes, has tended more and more to make life insecure. Young people have come to wonder what would be their lot when they came to old age. The man with a job has wondered how long the job would last. This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 million of our citizens. That's how it started. It's much bigger today, of course. 30 million who will reap direct benefits through unemployment compensation, through old age pensions, and through increased services for the protection of children and the prevention of ill health. We can never ensure 100% of the population against 100% of the hazards and vicissitudes of life. But we have tried to frame a law which will give some measure of protection to the average citizen and to the family against the loss of a job and against poverty-ridden old age. This law represents a cornerstone in a structure which is being built, but by no means complete. Here's a photo of Roosevelt meeting with his cabinet in 1938. You will see Frances Perkins in that hat and that very sedate dress and her characteristic pearls. The first monthly beneficiary under Social Security. She worked for 3 years under the Social Security program. The taxes on her salary during those years was a total of $24.75. Her initial monthly check was $22.54. During her lifetime, she collected a total of $22,888 in Social Security benefits. And here's Perkins with the chairman of the Social Security Board, Arthur Altmeyer, and they're celebrating the 26 millionth Social Security number in 1938. She spoke at the 25th anniversary of the Social Security Act in 1960. Look at the white hat for a change. Fast facts and figures about Social Security today. And of course, this is based on 2020, so they may have changed. But almost 70 million people received benefits in 2020. 55% of adult Social Security beneficiaries in 2020 were women. 55 was the average age of disabled worker beneficiaries. And 86% of supplemental Social Security income recipients received payments because of disability or blindness in 2020. If you're interested in statistics, you can go to the Office of Social Security and they will break them down even more for you. You can see what a wide-ranging program it is. She stayed in office until, of course, Roosevelt died in 1945. She had been attending the International Labor Conference since the 1940s. She wrote a book about her years with Roosevelt, and she became head of the US delegation to the International Labor Conferences that she continued to go to. This is a photo of her in her New York home in 1957, and I can't get over this photo. She's inside and she's wearing a hat. And then, believe it or not, she went to teach at Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations from 1957 until her death in 1965. Amazing. And in 1948, she gave 3 lectures at the St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue in New York. Most people don't know about this. As I said, her faith was very important. She went on an Episcopal retreat once a month, even while she was Secretary of Labor. And these lectures were called, quote, "The Christian in the World." And they're very revealing because she argued there was a connection between economics and politics and theology, spirituality. Her basic point that there must be a just social order. And in order to fulfill your commitment to God, you have to be part of building that just social order. In other words, political activities are a basic spiritual duty. And that's really how she felt. In fact, the Episcopal Church, as some of you may know, has saints that they recognize, and they have recognized Frances Perkins. There are the hats. This was done 5 years ago. And I have to say, hats off to Frank Perkins. I couldn't resist bringing a hat that I think she would have worn. It's kind of a sedate black hat. There are children's books about her, thank goodness. I love the title of the children's book on the left, "The Only Woman in the Photo." And that's, of course, true, the only woman in the photo of Roosevelt's cabinet. And this one by Kristen Downey, "The Life and Legacy of Frances Perkins," a really excellent book about her. Kristen Downey has written a lot, and she is considered probably the main biographer of Frances Perkins. There is a Frances Perkins Center. You might recognize the brick house in Newcastle, Maine. Newcastle is a beautiful little town, by the way, on the Damariscotta River. And this center publishes a lot of information about industrial conditions. They give scholarships, they do studies, they have research. This is a grandson And the very simple graves in Newcastle, her husband, Paul Wilson, on the left and Frances Perkins on the right, just says Secretary of Labor. That's all it says. But the United States Department of Labor did name a building after her in 1980. It is actually the Frances Perkins Building. And of course, a stamp was issued in her honor. When Perkins was asked what was the New Deal, she would say it was an attitude towards government, toward the people, toward labor, an attitude that found voice in expressions like the people are what matter to government. And a government should aim to give all of the people under its jurisdiction the best possible life. The only thing she really did not accomplish was universal health insurance. How different lives would be for millions of people in this country if we had universal health insurance. That's one of the things she wanted in the 1930s, but that was not something she could get through. And of course, we still have not been able to get that through. Secretary of Labor Willard Wirtz: every man and woman who works for a living wage under safe conditions, for reasonable hours, or who is protected by unemployment insurance or Social Security is her debtor. And the Frances Perkins Center has this wonderful poster. Did you know that a woman created Social Security, minimum wage, unemployment insurance, the 40-hour week, child labor laws, welfare, the protection of labor rights, and all the while the first female member of the cabinet? That woman was Frances Perkins. Amazing, isn't it? So what can I say about her in conclusion? Adam Cohen from Yale Law School has written, if American history textbooks accurately reflected the past, Frances Perkins would be recognized as one of the nation's greatest heroes, as iconic as Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Paine. A woman who was able to combine family obligations, difficult family obligations, at a time when it was rare for women to be able to combine that with a career. She paved the way for other female cabinet members. There wasn't one until 1953 when Eisenhower appointed Oveta Kalpalbi to health, education, and welfare. And it would be another 25 years before we got Carla Hills at HUD, but we've had dozens of female cabinet members now. She was well qualified to be Secretary of Labor. You realize she was 52. There had been 30 years of her coming to that point. The development of what I've called her social consciousness, her passion, her familiarity with labor conditions, her knowledge. I mean, that had built up for 30 years. What better qualified person to be Secretary of Labor during the Great Depression? Kristen Downey has said, the dour-looking woman in the tri-corner hat disguised a woman whose intelligence, compassion, creative genius, and fierce loyalty made her an exceptional figure in modern American history. And David Brooks, in his book, The Road to Character, who would ever have foreseen that this small, timid young woman of her college years would be able to endure so much hardship, the mental illnesses of her husband and actually later her daughter. She was a solitary woman in a hyper-masculine world. Decades of political battles and negative press and oh, what she accomplished. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Do we have any questions?
Yes.
There have been many studies about women of high achievement and power in the world, and they seem to have in common strong relationships and supportive fathers. So I wondered what happened to Susanna Wilson, whose father disappeared early in her life into an asylum and had a very busy mother.
Yes, she suffered herself from mental illness. Evidently, there was a genetic strain in the family. So she's really not somebody we talk about in terms of accomplishments. She struggled to maintain a normal kind of life. Yeah. But it's a good point. I think her father was very important to Frances Perkins, and he certainly was forward thinking for his time.
Thank you. Anne-Marie, go ahead on Zoom.
Yes, thank you. Well, once again, Barbara, you've inspired us all talking about a very inspirational leader. And I just want to share a little footnote. I think that may give added emphasis to how difficult, how challenging the time was for her to accomplish as much as she did. And I used to teach governmental history, so I knew something about the Social Security Administration and Social Security, as well as what she did at the Department of Labor. So I know this, and I used to teach it because I had mostly women students who were planning to become or already were public administrators at all levels, federal, state, and local. And there was nothing in the textbook about her. So you had to look all this stuff up for her biography. So times have changed on this. Now she's really recognized, excuse me, as a moral exemplar. But I just wanted to add this footnote because I thought it was fascinating. And that is that when she started off at trying to institutionalize the Social Security Board, which was the first iteration of the institutions that became the Social Security Administration, she wasn't just an inspirational leader anymore. She was a manager, and she was a manager on a day-to-day basis, cobbling together, taking money from here and there. She worked with Harry Hopkins, who wasn't even elected or appointed. He was one of basically FDR's right-hand man. And he used the Federal Emergency Relief Fund because, yeah, they passed the Social Security idea. The law was passed, but gave it no resources. So she and he basically cobbled this together. And it took 11 years to turn it into the Social Security Administration that we know today. So fascinating what this woman was able to accomplish. And I think you've made it very clear that unless we revisit history about this, we don't realize that what we face today in doing the same kinds of ventures takes a lot of work.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, for those comments. There was one wonderful anecdote. I think it was when she was designing the Fair Labor Standards Act, and she got all the people together in a room, and she put a bottle of whiskey on the table. And she said, "We're not leaving until we come up with a bill."
Thank you, Barbara. That, as usual, was an excellent talk, and I did learn a lot. I couldn't help but thinking when you were talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her position before the Supreme Court and how she worked incrementally to get more equal pay for women through using a very deliberate strategy to do so. Maybe you can comment. It was Ruth Bader Ginsburg influenced by her, and how?
Not that I know of, Lynn, but there may be something in Ginsburg's papers that mention Perkins. But I think your point about the incremental progress is important. You know, if there had not been the Great Depression and the economic crisis and the fact that people were desperate for something to be done and something to prevent it in the future, one wonders whether she would have been able to push this legislation through. I mean, she had been incrementally working on the state level, but to get it on the national level, I think it's partially the economic crisis, but I will have to check that because it's an interesting point. If Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who, as you know, is one of my other favorite people to talk about, if she had been influenced. Thank you.
Barbara, do you have a few more minutes? We have a couple hands
Sure.
still on Zoom. All right, Barbara Rothstein, go ahead.
You had to unmute. Thank you, Barbara. You filled in a lot of things that I didn't know. It was wonderful. And I am, my hometown is Worcester, Mass, although I spent a lot of time in Boston.
Yeah.
And I do have to say how the world has changed fairly recently. Worcester has renamed a library after her. And there are streets and housing, and I worked in a settlement house, but and so women are finally being recognized for what they did. And I just wanted to point out one little thing, which I know probably everybody knows, but just in case they don't know, the women jumped out of that building because they locked the doors to keep them in.
Yes,
and
thank you for mentioning that, Barbara. Yeah, the Triangle Fire, and I should have mentioned that they locked the doors because they didn't want women to steal bolts of cloth. And so the doors were locked and the fire escapes did not reach up to the upper floors. I mean, it was, the owners were terribly responsible for that tragedy. Yes.
I'd like to underscore something you said, that there was a huge gap between her being a cabinet member and then the next women to join in, connecting that to what you said about her absence from the history books. And I think that it's really important to focus on what we leave out of our history books that we use to educate children. Yeah. As a shaper of our social consciousness. I found when I was teaching at one point in Maryland that the Maryland history books did not include any mention of Joe McCarthy or his hearings. And I think that had a huge effect, as well as, leaving out the women influential in our country.
Thank you for those comments. And many of you have heard me say that every history book is put together by people who have various views. And they put some things in and they leave some things out. And no history book is complete ever because there's just too much information. So there are always things that are left out, but for years, of course, women's history was left out. Now a lot of women's history is incorporated, but still there are individual women who are not, and Frances Perkins is certainly a good model of social consciousness and responsibility. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. All right, final question from June. Gerard? Please unmute, please unmute.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Barbara, that was great. Thank you so much. I'd like to know if you know anything about the male physician in the Middle West who was credited with working on or suggesting Social Security.
I don't.
Well, I think it's interesting because that was the first time in history that I read about Social Security, and he was given credit for writing to Roosevelt and explaining he had these older patients that needed help. It never mentioned Frances Perkins.
No, do you have his name?
No, I don't remember, it's
Of-
back then, but
You know,
I think I'm going to go home and put the question to Google, who's my new friend.
well, you know, of course, that many European nations already had programs that benefited older people and were, in a sense, an early Social Security. We were behind, as usual, on that.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
And Barb, hopefully you see those compliments right there. And I think on behalf of everyone here and on Zoom and for our ILR semester, we thank you again.
You're welcome.
Okay, Lee.
I love this.